A third way of thinking that I noticed that I engaged in is what I call I was disconnected. My head and my body were not in the same place. My body would be in one place, but my head was someplace else. And this idea came to me from the work of Eckhart Tolle. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with Eckhart's work. He's a Vancouver author, wrote the book, The Power of Now. And Eckhart asks a very simple question. He says, where do you hang out? The past, the present, or the future? Research tells us that most people are not here. Most people are not present. What Eckhart says is, in general, elderly people live in the past. They live in memory. They say, I remember when. Young people live in the future. They live in anticipation. They say, I can hardly wait till this happens, or hardly wait till that happens. And very few people are actually in this moment, in this second, with our head and our body in the same place at the same time. And when I thought about what Eckhart had to say and I began to examine where I was hanging out, I realized I was never here. I was always in the future. Occasionally in the past. And then I was into a negative future. And so I came to understand how that way of being was a source of my suffering. One of the other things that I began to notice too is that when I would be disconnected, I would feel this churning in my gut. And I've come to the conclusion that I think that the Creator, when the human body was made, wired us with a home alarm system. And it's not unlike the alarm system that we have where there's a contact, and when you break the contact, the alarm goes off, and when you close the contact, it goes silent again. Because what I came to recognize is that when my head and my body were in the same place at the same time, it was nice and quiet inside of me. And when I got disconnected, I would feel this charge through me that I think is the alarm saying, put yourself back together. I think road rage is a lot about that. I think road rage happens because I'm here in my car, but I think I should be up there. And that tension starts to course through our bodies, and it leaks out in all kinds of strange ways. What I notice is that when I allow myself to be exactly where I am, it's nice and quiet inside. A fourth way of thinking that I noticed that I would engage in is I would say, I don't want to, but I have to. I have no choice. I don't want to take out the garbage, but I have to. I don't want to clean toilets, but I have to. I don't want to go to work, but I have to. I don't want to pay my taxes, but I have to. And what I noticed was that when I said those things to myself, I would feel angry or resentful or powerless. And when I thought about that, I realized that that's really sounds like the definition of a victim. Ray Willem, the fellow that taught me about mistakes, he says there's a disease on the planet today that is in epidemic proportions. And he calls the disease victimitis, where we act like we're victims. When I examined those thoughts that I was saying to myself about I don't want to, but I have to, I came to the conclusion that all of those statements were false. The truth was I did all of those behaviors because I wanted what it would bring me now or what I thought it would bring me in the future. And so I paid my taxes, I went to work, I cleaned toilets, I took out the garbage because I wanted the consequences of those behaviors. But I constantly hear the language of I don't want to, but I have to. And so again, I got curious, how do we get to this place? We're not born this way, so what is it in our culture that teaches us to think that way? And then I was watching TV one day or something, and I heard a politician say, well, we have no choice but to raise taxes. And then I heard the CEO of a company say, well, we have no choice but to lay off 400 employees. And then I got it. When the leaders in our community tell us they have no choice, it's not surprising that we too come to believe we have no choice. Except it's not true. If the politician was honest, he would say something like, I've reviewed all of the options before me, and based upon what I value and the outcomes that I'm looking for, I made a decision to raise taxes. The same with the CEO. I've reviewed all of the options before me, and based upon what I value and the things that I'm looking for, I made a decision to lay off 400 employees. I don't know about you, but I rarely hear those kinds of statements. I rarely hear people taking responsibility for their decisions, for their behavior. Another way of thinking that I noticed I would engage in is what I would call resist reality. And what that sounds like is I would say things like, my son should never have been damaged by that vaccine shot. The window shouldn't have been broken. The car accident shouldn't have happened. The Canucks should be winning more games. And when I began to look at that, what I realized was when I would make those kinds of statements, I would feel angry or resentful. And then I began to realize how insane those statements really are. Because all of those statements is about resisting something that already exists. And resisting it is not going to change it. What resisting does is it changes me into somebody who's resentful or angry or feels powerless. But reality is not going to be changed by resisting it. And yet I spent much of my life resisting reality, saying it shouldn't be this way. This should never have happened. A sixth way of thinking that I noticed I engaged in regularly is what I call delay happiness. And what that sounds like is I would say, I'll be happy when? I'll be happy when the weekend comes. I'll be happy when my holidays come. I'll be happy when my mortgage is paid off. I'll be happy when I get married. I'll be happy when I get divorced. What I began to recognize is that I was always projecting happiness into the future, never owning it in this moment. That I always had conditions, I always had obstacles that had to be met. And what I noticed was even when I got those conditions met, I very quickly replaced it with another condition, and another, and another. And so what I've come to recognize is happiness isn't about getting those things, it's about a way of thinking. And the way of thinking that I grew up with in our culture is that happiness was really elusive. It was just around the corner. If you believe all the advertisements that we get inundated with, you'll be happy just after you got that product or that service or that car or whatever it is. I remember as a kid watching cartoons, and in one of the cartoons that has stuck with me all these years was the cartoon of a donkey, and the owner of the donkey suspended a carrot in front of the donkey. And so the donkey would walk towards the carrot, but never get to it. And it was the clever owner's way of getting the donkey to keep moving. And I realized I've spent most of my life like the donkey, walking towards it but never getting it. I've also come to recognize as you could replace that word with I'll be happy when with I'll be forgiving when, I'll be generous when, I'll be loving when. And so where do we delay those experiences? Where do we set conditions that never get met, that are always proved to be elusive? I'm assuming that there's many more ways of thinking that I engaged in, but those are the ones that I began to recognize and notice that when I thought those ways, it would walk me in the direction of anger, sadness, and despair. My invitation to you is to simply notice where you're walking. Which direction are you walking in? Is what you're doing working? In my counseling practice, people regularly ask me what the right answer is. And I reply the way many therapists reply. Instead of answering, I ask another question. And so I say to them, is what you're doing now working? And they usually say, no, that's why I'm here. And so I say, well, that's not the right answer then. My job is to generate possibilities. Your job is to play with the possibilities until you get the outcome that you want. That's the right answer. But none of us know what it is before the fact. I've come to recognize life is like a grand experiment. And so it's important to keep asking the question, is what I'm doing working? To me, we ask the wrong question in our culture. We ask, is it right or is it wrong? And I think that that's not a helpful question. Does it work? Is what I'm doing working? Is a much better question.